We are live.
Hey, everybody.
That's what they say.
I thought they saw the whole thing.
I'm gonna have to find out from Linda who makes that homemade pecan pie. If it's her, maybe we would say support her. Pecan pie is my favorite. Pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Way to go, Meg.
I just made the muffins. They were pretty good,
Pumpkin muffin.
even though I accidentally added tomino instead of cinnamon.
Tamale dressing.
Ooh, that sounds good.
That sounds really good, Rachel. But it's her in-laws tamale dressing. So I wonder if she has the recipe. Pumpkin pecan pie.
Oh,
It's superior. Of course, Travis would say it's superior. Yes. That doesn't surprise me. Homemade cornbread dressing.
You lost me at homemade.
I agree, Julie. Homemade mashed potatoes. For real mashed potatoes.
I can make.
Not the flake. Not the flake.
What was that? Broccoli and rice casserole. Yum.
With cheese. The ones I see always have lots of
I
cheese.
will add cheese if you give me the option.
Brittany Moreland has a different Thanksgiving than I do because she's got baked beans and potato salad at hers. I've never had that at Thanksgiving, but that sounds like a new tradition to start. Turkey and dressing.
Yep. Good old reliable turkey.
Katie's traditional. That's like a period, just a dot.
That means everything.
Oh, is that what it means? Everything? You'll have a funny, like comment in a moment.
Homemade cranberry sauce. Now, there was one year where I made 3 different versions of homemade cranberry sauce. They were all good.
I've only seen it out of a can.
And I've not spent that much time in the kitchen since. I'm just saying.
Okay, it's 4:05, Lily. Are we ready to go?
All right, guys. Welcome to our first live stream of the year, and we are super excited for it to be the STAAR Accommodations training. And we have the hostesses with the mostesses, Colette Pledger and Dr. Amy Perez. Welcome, ladies.
It's the most exciting training of the year. Is that
Most
what you're saying?
exciting,
Yeah. Mhm.
Hey,
We'll go
it's
with
going to
that.
be a blast. That's right.
I feel like
that's
I
right.
should have a funny joke, but I don't.
Yeah,
I don't have one.
I don't either.
Okay,
Well,
we
lots
will
of
get
cornbread,
started.
lots of things being shared today. So
Yes,
we're gonna get it
unfortunately,
going.
we didn't provide you with the cornbread homemade pecan pie, pumpkin pecan pie, or the dressing, but
But you provided us with an increase in our appetite, so
That's
we're grateful
right.
for that.
that's right. Now we're ready. An appetite for learning something new.
That's right.
See what I did?
Good
That's the best joke,
connection.
best joke I got. Okay, we will start. And if you guys have questions, please put them in the comments. And if there's something that we can answer, we will. Sometimes when we get into accommodations training, there are specific questions about specific students. And so it's hard to make a generic answer with stuff like that, but we will do our best. For those of you that have had the opportunity to attend this for many years, there are just a few changes this year, but not a bunch of significant changes. So that's really kind of nice. And on one hand, and on the other hand, you get to hear the same thing again. So we will get started with that. So we're going to talk about accommodations and their eligibility criteria. And then at the end, we'll talk about accommodations related to classroom accommodations versus STAAR accommodations. So a lot of the things we'll talk about will be STAAR related, and then some of it will be. So that's kind of what I just said. So we're going to start with general information. So this year, something that is new is that TEA has created a chart to define accessibility features. And so there is a link right there, and I'm going to show you, we will put that link on the assessment page in the staff resources site. When you go to that link, it looks like this. So it lists that accessibility feature. It gives you a description of the accessibility feature, and then it gives allowed examples and not allowed examples. So one of the things is they really defined each one of these, like blank scratch paper, what it is, what it's not. It's blank. It can't have any darkened lines, anything on it that would make it not blank and appear as a graphic organizer.
Seems silly, but you know, there are people that did it wrong, and that's why they have to be that specific. I mean, that's the same reason we have speed limits and dress codes, because some people just don't know the difference between right and wrong, but I digress.
So those are new, where it outlines all of that on the right-hand side of not allowed examples and allowed examples. And previously we did not have that. We just kind of had a list. So that is a new chart this year. We'll also reference, and it's on the staff resources site under assessment, where Region 12 has created some information about accessibility features. So accommodations.
What are accommodations? I think you're probably wondering that, right? Well, accommodations are changes in materials or procedures that enable students to access instruction and assessment. And that's how my Amy brain remembers it. Accommodation starts with ACC. So that helps me remember it gives students access to information and assessments. So accommodations also mediate the effects of their disability or their learning difficulty. Accommodations do not change the curriculum. That's a modification. So we're not talking about that. This is just access. ACC. Accommodations give access. And the accommodations have to be chosen based on each student's individual needs and eligibility. The goal of accommodations is what we've already said. We want the child or the student to be able to access the information and or reveal what they've learned, possibly in a different way. So there could be an accommodation for that, where they do maybe a presentation instead of a written document. But the long-term goal is that we give accommodations and then we fade them out over time, because the student learns to use them independently. And then sometimes they need them forever. And then sometimes students grow out of accommodations. So they're flexible. The art committee has the power to change those and add those, but you already know what I'm going to say. You got to have the data to make the change. So show me the data.
Okay, so accommodation requirements is that they have to be provided as written in the MTSS plan, an LPAC committee plan, a 504 plan, or an IEP plan. And so for Robinson ISD, we put all of those plans in a system that's called Embrace, that talks to a system called Test Hound, which is what we use for testing purposes. And so they have to be documented in those places correctly in order for it to pull over and turn those on into Cambium, Tide, the platform that we use. So all of those different programs, it's very important. So it has to have documentation to prove that the accommodations are being implemented as written in the plan as well. And I know we'll talk about how to document those throughout there, that you have to have a plan for documentation. And then you have to regularly check to determine if the accommodation are serving their intended purpose. So like it said on the last page, the long-term goal is that we're able to put some things in place for students, and then they're able to, a lot of them, be able to provide that for themselves in the future. They don't need that accommodation, such as like if you give structured reminders, individualized structured reminders, ideally the kid would learn how to take those breaks or different things that they need. And then over time, they wouldn't have to have individualized structured reminders. They would just have reminders to stay on task or something like that and be able to provide themselves with their breaks. So each state assessment accommodation must directly correlate to a classroom accommodation that's used routinely and effectively in the classroom. So each accommodation has to be documented in accordance with our expectations in the district, which we just talked about, as well as state and federal guidelines. So it doesn't mean that just because an accommodation is not available on a state assessment that they couldn't have it as a classroom accommodation, but there are certain things that are only allowed on state assessments. And if you are asking for that to be on a state assessment for a student, then it also would need to be something that you have data to prove is needed in a classroom accommodation. So accommodations in the assessment assure that they can interact appropriately with the test. It doesn't change the test or the content of the test. It just allows all test takers to demonstrate their knowledge and answer questions with that accommodation on the test.
So accommodations that you want to consider, because what you want to do is you want to consider instructional and STAAR. You don't have to make a decision for one or the other, but if it's a STAAR accommodation you're considering, it needs to correlate with something that they're already getting in instruction. And accommodations have to be routinely and effectively used during instruction and district testing. Okay, and it can be determined by a 504 committee. We already said this, LPAC, ARD, sometimes the MTSS.
So what do accommodations look like on the assessment? So there are 3 different types. Those have not changed. So if you've got to attend this before, they're the same for state assessments. There's accessibility features, and those are available for all students that need it. And you really don't have to have documentation for the accessibility features. They're just things that you know as a teacher that students need and use. And they're oftentimes things that we just do in the classroom all the time because they're best teaching practices.
Right.
Then there are the locally approved designated supports, and they have to meet specific eligibility criteria and order, and specific groups have to make those decisions. And then there are designated supports. Those are the ones that require TA approval. There's only a limited number of those, and we have very few students that typically we discuss that with. This just tells you what is a graphic that shows you available accommodations by academic committee. So if you wanted to say which things can MTSS approve, which things can the ARD committee, which things can 504 approve, which things can LPAC committee do, those are the things that you'd want to talk about. Speaking of LPAC, there is a big change this year. One of the changes you'll want to mark down for our EB students, emergent bilinguals is what they are, formerly ESL students, is that students now can receive reclassification even if they have those accommodations on STAAR. And previously that was not allowed. Another thing is that students who are parent denials, we have very few of those, but if a parent does deny services and a student qualified for EB services, they also can now have access to these accommodations on STAAR. And both of those things were previously not in place. That's also in accompaniment with some changes in accountability with TELPAS testing, where students can be reclassified based on their composite TELPAS score instead of having to score in specific in all of the areas of listening, speaking, reading, and writing.
And those LPAC, those accommodations also need to be in their instruction, not just on STAAR.
Correct. Yes. So here are some key updates. Text-to-speech tracking. So knowing what text-to-speech. So in the testing environment this year, it's going to highlight and track when things are being read. And so if you have text-to-speech on, it's going to do that tracking and highlighting of things as it's reading. And so for some students, and some of you are probably like, yay, I've wanted it to do that for forever. And others of you are thinking that's going to be really annoying for some of my students, and there's no way to turn that off. So that's just something that you want to know. That is an update. Another thing that's an update, which is probably a yay, it's an RLA pre-read presentation enhancement. If you've been around for a while, back when we had STAAR or all of those other types of tests and SDA before that, we had pre-reading passages. A lot of times they were put in place initially for students with dyslexia initially in order to read those proper nouns and give some information. And so That's similar to what is out there now. So they will have an RLA pre-read presentation enhancement for text-to-speech students, where it will pre-read like a summary, some information with some key information, what you would normally do in the classroom for students.
Is that only for text-to-speech students or every student?
Yes, only for text-to-speech. Okay. Then also, I already told you about the accessibility table update. And then you don't have to worry about an ARF submission deadline. That's for those few students that might need a special request. This is going to show you the text-to-speech tracking. So it shows you what that kind of looks like, how it's highlighting. It's a little bit hard to see on these slides, but it's highlighting those areas. That shows it a little bit better, how it's tracking. It's going to highlight the whole line and then highlight each of those words as it's moving along. There's an example of the pre-reading passage, highlighting some important vocabulary words we typically do in the classroom before we read things with students. For RLA practice tests, it will be available soon, so that students who do have that as a pre-read text-to-speech, it will start to be available for them. I already showed you this accessibility table. And then this is just highlighting the authority for decision-making, how it's highlighted in the accessibility table. And then that next one you do not need to worry about. So this is talking about ARD committees making changes, maybe if there's something that's come up with this pre-reading passage or document current or correct information that the ARD committee have to meet again, that they can do an amendment to make those changes. And we already do that quite frequently, actually. So the local decision-making of a 504 committee would ensure that the accommodations plan is current for the current school year. So we've recently made some adjustments with the way that we're meeting on 504 students. But again, you still do have to make sure that your current plan is in place and documented and valid for this school year as well. And then MTSS committee, so you guys meet on those as well. That is another decision-making authority. And then we've talked already several times about the LPAC. So
these are some accommodation resources, and you can click on each link at another time so that you don't get lost in our presentation. The quick view is a 3-column document. It's really good to read. The DCCR website, I don't know that they would need to read that or access it, but you can. That DCCR stands for District Campus Coordinator Resources. Okay, so there you go. And then I'm going to make the positive assumption that you already know the TEA accommodation website, and hopefully you have that starred as a favorite and refer to it every time you consider accommodations for kids.
And then one of the resources that's not on this, because these slides came from Region 12, but that we've promoted a lot in our district last year, is Accommodations Central. So it is a Region 13 product. So another ESC service center kind of updates that and facilitates that. And it is a great resource. So if you are new to us this year, or you have forgotten about that resource, I highly encourage you to go there. It's super easy to search by accommodation. It tells you everything that you would have to look on multiple pages to find on the TA site in one spot. There's even videos to help you understand. And then it also gives you these cards and tips on even what to do to implement, and documentation and tracking that you would bring to try to put that accommodation in place for a student. And so I have found it to be very helpful whenever we're talking about accommodations for students. I have learned a lot by going to that resource.
And you can just Google Accommodation Central to find that. And I think
it's linked on our staff resources site on the assessment page as well.
I think you can even put in what your concerns are, and they can predict possible accommodations that could help that student's disability or their struggles. But it's been a while since I've been there, so go check it out. Tell me if I'm right or wrong.
So now we're going to go through the accessibility features, locally approved designated supports, and then the designated supports that require TA approval. And so if you have questions along the way, or you need us to slow down, let us know. But we've kind of already gone over the bigger changes. So there's just a couple of other changes through here that we'll point out to you. We have already kind of talked about that. So on the attachment that Dr. Perez was talking about, that is a Region 12 created, it is one document that's linked, and it says Accommodation Quick View by Region 12, and it is color coded. So the first couple of pages are green, the next few pages are blue, and then the last pages are purple. And so you'll here open that one document, you do, as I made the mistake several times thinking it was 3 separate documents. It's actually one, and it's just all linked, and then the color of it changes as you go through.
Right. So as this refers to green sheets, Those are the items listed in the green section of the document.
And those are all the accessibility features. So as we talked about before, accessibility features are things that anybody can use. They cannot be required to use them during testing, but they are available to any student. Devices, it makes sounds louder for certain students if they need that, bilingual dictionaries, blank place markers, or line readers if they needed that. But that is embedded in the highlighter tool and the line reader tool within the platform. So you can't make students use it, but we would want to teach students that need to use that tool in advance so that they hopefully use it on the day of testing. Color settings and color overlay, highlighters, colored pencils, pens, etc., and individual administration. And individual administration is, they made a, it's one student and one test administrator in one room by themselves. So means literally one-on-one in a room. Medical devices. So we've talked about this lately too. If a student needs to be able to have their phone on their desk because they have a medical device and the teacher needs to have their device out for our students. Specifically, this typically comes up whenever students, we're monitoring glucose levels for students that are diabetic. We need to make sure that that is in their plan, that they have that medical device as a need, and then everyone in that room knows that it's allowed and it's allowed to be out and it's documented. Minimize distractions to maintain focus, what tools those are. Great to have those in a plan if those are needed for students. And then if you need to enlarge the test materials in any way. So we have had some students where we have used a projection device for them in the past, and that is allowed, but you would definitely want to make sure that we did know about that. Even though it says documentation is not required, really we need to make sure it's documented somewhere, because otherwise the testing coordinator on your campus would not know. And that's projection devices I just talked about, reminders to stay on task. That's you just reminding the student to stay on task, just like we would normally. And then read aloud to self. You definitely want to make sure that your test administrators know about this in advance for students, because we typically want to provide them with those whisper phones, or we need to make sure they're in an individual administration if they're not using one of those, or they talk really loud when they read things aloud to themselves. So reading assistance is only available to students on the 3rd grade math test, and it has to function as normal text to speech. So last year, this was a change where you cannot ever, under any circumstance, read anything from a computer's screen to a student. So in the past, you could do this for 3rd grade, but now if a student raises their hand and asks you to read a word or phrase during the test, you need to have the student pause the test, log out of the test, contact your campus testing coordinator. They turn on text to speech, student restarts, and then they would have text to speech, because you are not allowed to read anything from a child's computer to them. But again, that's 3rd grade math only if a student asks to have it. So you can't mass assign text to speech to all 3rd grade students. You can't decide that a student needs it and turn it on if the student asks for it, or has regularly asked, or has a documented reading disability, as we'll talk about later on in a locally designated support. Then they can have text to speech. Scratch paper, we've already really talked about that, blank scratch paper. Signing or providing oral interpretation for students that would need that, and then small group administration. Again, while it's not required multiple documentation, these are accessible for all students. You and I both know if we want students in a small group, someone has to be documented somewhere and somebody has to know. Right. Otherwise, they're not going to be put in a small group on test day. We do get to determine what is. TEA does not define that. It's any group that is smaller than our typical testing group. So if your typical testing groups are 20, it's anything smaller than 20. We typically try to keep them to 10 or less, depending upon the room size or the number of test administrators in the room, but there's no hard and fast rule.
Right. No magic number.
Translating test directions, the Zoom tool and magnifying devices, again, are available to all students within the platform. That got us all the way to designated supports.
Okay, I'm going to try to take over, but I know that I'm going to need Colette to bounce in. So the designated supports are the ones that must be documented, must be tied to their eligibility and their need, and approved by a local resource, a local team of people. Who are those local teams of people? You already know the answer, so let me just read your mind. ARD committees, 504 committees, LPAC, and MTSS. Those are the ones that can approve the designated supports.
You made 100.
Thank you. So basic transcribing, and all of these are going to be blue. So when you're looking at that attached document, you're going to go to the slides that have blue across the title of those. So it allows responses to be entered into TDS when a student has a disabling condition. Let's read this together. That the student from independently entering responses through keyboarding or the use of a mouse. So that's what basic transcribing is. There's another type of transcribing that goes to our next section of accommodations, and a lot of people get those confused. So know that basic transcribing falls under designated supports. There's a question over turning on text to speech. Can you type your question and then we can read it? Oh, here it comes.
Yes, Deborah. What if there's somebody in your hallway? Like what I would do is have the kid log out. If it were me, y'all can decide on your campus. I would flip my sign outside my door to be that help is needed, just like you would for anything else that you did. And your hall monitor would come down and then be able to get your testing coordinator to then go in and turn that on. And then they would tell you, and then the student could log back in. It doesn't take very long to do that. That's unfortunately the process that we currently have. So, but yes, that's exactly what I would do. That was a great question.
What was the question?
About turning on text to speech for the grade 3 students for math.
How to do it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
So this is more about basic transcribing. The student can dictate or sign information to be recorded into the margins of the test booklet or in the notes for the online test. This does not apply to as a mouth calculation or responses in the written composition. Students must be given the full time allotted to complete the entire test. It is allowable for the student to review the transcription and make any edits within the time constraints of the test. So you can't give them the time of the test and then they get to edit. It's got to happen within the time of the test.
Right. So just remember that this is people that they have a disabling condition that prevents the student from independently entering responses through keyboarding or the use of a mouse. So it's somebody who cannot physically do that.
Mm-hmm.
It could happen. That would be emergency medical, like if they break their hands or something like that. That would be different. That we would put in place. So I know that wouldn't be planned in advance, but typically that's what this is. The next one is Braille. And so this is very specific, and we don't have anybody currently who's using Braille. So I'm just going to skip through those, but it is an option.
Ooh, calculation aids. This can also get confusing. So let's be real specific about what's on this slide. I'm going to do what they say never do and basically read the slide to you. But calculation aids provide an alternate method of computation for a student, because I want you to listen, for a student who is unable, not chooses not to, not we don't think it's their best way to do it, a student who is unable to effectively use paper and pencil methods. A student may receive this support if the student is served by an ARD committee or 504. So they're telling you those are the two local decision-making groups that can make this decision. General eligibility, just like all the other accommodations, right? This is not new to you. Routinely, independently, and effectively uses it during classroom instruction and testing. Then we have specific eligibility for grades 3 and 4. So for grades 3 and 4, in order to have a calculation aid, that student has to have a physical disability, not a perceived physical disability, not what we think would be easier for them, but a physical disability that prevents the student from independently writing numbers, or a visual impairment that prevents them from seeing numbers. And that's correct. No, even with correction. And then there's even more specificity for grades 5 through 7. So again, the student has to have a physical disability that prevents them from independently writing numbers, or a visual impairment that prevents them from seeing numbers, or a disability that affects math calculation. Here's the hard part: even after intensive instruction or remediation. So we have to be able to document that we've tried different kinds of intervention. Intensive kind of define in different ways. That we've tried remediation multiple times in multiple ways. And then and only then, if they're unable to write numbers, then they can maybe be considered for a calculation aid. But that's not an Amy decision. That's not a Colette decision. That's a committee decision, 504 or ARD. And if a student is EB, emergent bilingual, with a disability, the student has to be made, again, at the ARD committee with an LPAC representative there.
So then in 8th grade, we all know that all students then are able to have calculation devices. So these are things in place because they assume that students are still learning how to work with numbers at the younger grades. That's why it's even harder at grades 2 through 4, and then a little bit easier to qualify at 5 through 7. So most of the time when we look at it 5 through 7 is as somebody who has a disability, and then we have to make sure that we've done the intensive instruction and remediation for the students. Then we go to calculation aids of what is allowed. So then after you've decided that it is approved and the committee decides they do have that math calculation disability and that you have provided them intensive intervention and they're not being successful, then you can provide a basic 4-function handheld calculator like ones we could go get from the Dollar Tree or we need. And that's basically all that they get. A basic calculator is available as an online embedded support. They can have it in the online embedded support, which will automatically be turned on if they have that. And then they can also have one on the table in front of them. They could also use an abacus if someone is still using that. We could typically call them Rec and Recs, but I learned the difference between them. An abacus has 10 beads in one color and then 10 in another, and Rec and Rec has 5 and then 5. So they could use a 0 to 9 addition grid without special numbers identified, or a grade specific and appropriate multiplication grid without special numbers or perfect squares indicated. So those are your options for basic calculation aids.
Okay, content and language supports. This accommodation allows for different types of assistance. And again, I'm going to read the slide. It can provide scaffolded directions, assistance with tracking, with, again, now that they have text to speech, that's automatically going to happen. Graphic organizers, simplified language, graphic representation of vocabulary and concepts that supports a student's understanding of selections, test questions, and answer choices. This decision can be made by the ARD committee, the 504 committee, or an LPAC representative or LPAC committee. And again, if they're identified as special ed, that LPAC rep has to be at the ARD before this decision is made.
And these are provided in the online platform as pop-ups and rollovers. So that might not look the same in the classroom, but we can do those supports on their curriculum-based assessments through Eduphoria. But in the classroom, it's going to look like I'm clarifying language for kids. I'm giving them lots of support with vocabulary. I simplify the language of vocabulary words, or I might give them a graphic to help them understand the vocabulary words. So that's what it would look like in classroom instruction on a day-to-day basis.
Hold on, I was going to say something about that. What you provide in the classroom, you could also do graphic representations. I think you said that, vocabulary, yeah. And then when we look at writing, it will only have pre-reads prior to the editing passages. So reading selections, including English 1 and 2, will have pre-reads prior to the selections.
And that's what the content and language supports.
Right. So that's the difference in the writing and the reading, English 1 and 2, where that pre-read option is listed, is provided in the test. Pre-reads closely align with how the vocabulary is previewed in instruction and provided support for that vocabulary comprehension. And STAAR and STAAR Spanish have embedded supports for the paper, with embedded supports for paper. We don't need to worry about that. We don't do paper.
No, everybody's online.
Yep. So I think that's all there is about designated supports.
Right. So I think what that's saying is before the revision passages that there won't be pre-reading. It's only going to be before the editing passages on
in
the writing portions of our assessments. Okay, so one of the individualized structured reminders section, that is whenever you're wanting a student to have specific reminders to stay on task. So more than just, hey, stay awake, or hey, get back on task, something like that. This used to be things like paper clips on the paper to divide it up. So this would be more specific, like I'm going to set a timer on your desk and every 5 minutes, or you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And after you finish 5 questions, you're going to get up and take a break. That would mirror the paper clips or adhesive notes. So your more frequent, less frequent breaks, structured reminders could be part of a behavior plan. I already mentioned the timer. You could have index notes or color codes on something to tell a kid with reminders to continue working or something like that. But it would be specific to a student, usually as part of a behavior plan, something that you've seen that you need to put in place.
That's already in place and that the student is using independently, routinely, and effectively.
And so students that have this, they might need to be in a separate setting if you have to eliminate distractions. That's not a hard and fast always have to be the case. I know I always had students that worked better for me and was used to me putting some of these things in place. And so it was better for them to stay in my classroom. So it just depends. If they are distracting to others, they need to be removed for that reason, then that would also be something to consider. They might need assistance with certain reminders. They might need help. And then it gives you a little bit TELPAS, and then making sure that you do not use secure state assessment in order to help them put these things in place.
And I want to mention about visual timers. Sometimes those can be effective, but one thing you definitely want to consider is, unless they're in an individual assessment, turn off the noise of the timer, because a lot of timers have noises. So you got to turn that off. But visual timers, they make them large, small, different shapes, different colors. So that's an option too for those two committees to consider.
Right. And that's a point. If they do need the timer that does make a loud noise, then they would clearly have to be in our individual administration. So we have to think about that whenever we only have so many rooms and so many people, especially students, but also make sure that we try multiple different things to see what would work. Large print. I mean, so really for this one is going to be in large test materials. They all have the Zoom feature online now. So typically we're probably not going to need anything beyond being able to zoom in on our devices since we take anything. Somebody who has a severe vision problem, we have been able to project and that has worked. So a printed copy is usually smaller than what you can zoom on or project. So anything else on large print? I think that's probably about it on large print.
Yeah.
Okay.
Manipulating test materials. So this allows the test administrator to physically manipulate the test materials or online tools or equipment for a student who's unable to do so independently. Not a student that asks for it, not a student that we do it for them all the time. This is a student that is unable to do it independently. So a student can receive this support. Again, it tells us who gets to make that decision. Art committee, 504 committee, MTSS committee, RTI Old School, and well, that's our MTSS team. So if they're receiving that service or that support, it can be put in place.
I would see this one probably pairing with basic transcribing, to be honest. And so this would be, like have some examples. Some of those are with paper, but online it would be the same thing. So math manipulatives. Do you want to do this one? Supports are concrete objects or pictures of concrete objects for a student to move and touch in order to visualize abstract concepts. So when we talk in math, we talk about concrete, representational, abstract. So these are kids that have not been able to move from concrete representational to abstract. They still need the concrete, or maybe they're stuck in representational and they need the pictures in order to be able to move to abstract. So they have to meet certain eligibility criteria in order to use this support, and they have to use those accommodations regularly in the classroom. They must be able to use them on their own. So no one can tell them which ones to use or whatever. It needs to be something, and they would have to be individualized. So we can't say, oh, all grade 4 students that get math manipulatives get this baggie of items. It needs to be something specific to those kids that they know how to use and that they're going to use. And I know that's what we've been doing, but just to reiterate that to everyone. So they do list only things that are allowed in these items of manipulatives. And so there is a list there that you can find on that TA site that tells you what you can have. And it is only those things. So if it's not on that list, don't ask if you can add it because TA says no.
No need to ask if it's not on the list. So oral and signed administration, that allows test materials to be read aloud or signed to a student. Reference materials for reading support during an oral administration can also be interpreted. So this obviously is something that they get regularly during instruction, right? Routinely, effectively, and independently get to benefit from that, or it's effective. So we have to know that that's happening, and you have to know exactly what that is. So it's providing exactly what it says, oral administration. Whomever is doing the oral administration has to be specifically trained to do that. So not necessarily every test administrator can do that. And then we talk about where, how many people, and those are, I think, situational decisions that need to be made. Like you mentioned earlier, if they're using a whisper phone, we may be able to have 2 or 3 in the same space, depending on the size of the space, yada, 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 lots of things to consider.
And through the online platform, we can only use text to speech. Just a reminder, you cannot read anything off of the computer screen to anybody, but you do have 2 options.
Unless it's 3rd grade math.
You cannot,
if they ask.
If they ask, but you can't read it off the screen. You have to have text to speech turned on.
Correct.
So you do have 2 options now. This changed a couple of years ago: regular text to speech or automated text to speech. Mm-hmm. Regular is that they can select anything that they want read to them throughout. Automatic means it's going to automatically read it, and they can't go on to the next question until it automatically reads it. And remember, this year it's going to also highlight that and highlight each word as it reads it. So just make sure that you know like which type that the student needs, and that you know that it's going to make them hear everything, whether they want to or not, with automated. And for some students, that's the way to go. And for other students, you and I both know that that's not. So you know your kids best, and you know which ones they need if they qualify for this.
So here's another memory trick for that. Automated starts with A, and that means all. That's another way to help you remember the difference between the 2. And can a student go between the 2, or they have to just have one of the 2?
One is just turned on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's turned on auto text to speech because it'll have to be documented in their plan which one that they want.
Right.
And then it's turned on in the Cambium platform that way. TIDE, whatever acronym you want to use, the platform that runs the state testing.
The thing, the place. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we kind of covered all of those different things. A couple of other different things that are new with oral and signed administration. We highlighted that there for you because you probably would not catch it, as I would not have if it had not been pointed out to me. So previously, it did not say the student is identified with limited vision. So that is new. So oral signed administration, if a student has identified with limited vision, they could qualify for oral signed administration. Another thing that is new, AKA being removed, I guess I would say, is OHI ADHD. So that was removed from something that qualifies as a student to receive text to speech. So now the only way are those bulleted areas, and they more defined that last bullet by saying the student has documented evidence of reading difficulties, which was there before, but in the example it listed OHI ADHD, and it is not anymore. Now it says tier 2 or 3 reading addressed in an MTSS plan, reading issues are addressed in the IEP or 504 plan. So it doesn't mean that they have to have a reading disability, but reading would have to be addressed in their IEP or their 504 plan. And I think typically you don't address reading issues if they don't have that presented as a need or information to support that. So I think you would thing that documents evidence of a reading disability. So that is something new that you guys would want to know that is a change. So I said there weren't many new, but that is one new. This is just talking about EBs being able to have access to oral signed administration, which is we call text to speech. So on constructed response questions, students must meet eligibility requirements for text-to-speech oral admin prior to the administration of the test. You should not provide the support by reading the secure content from the screen. So I guess they thought it was so important, it had to be in here like 5 times. For a student who meets eligibility criteria, its designated support may be used in the ways indicated in the tables. So you can see over there what is available to be read aloud to students. So those pre-reading passages that I mentioned earlier come with those content and language supports. For students, if they have content and language supports, they have those pre-reading passages. Those pre-reading passages are listed there and would be read aloud if the student qualified, because it's considered a content and language support. Okay, I hope I said all of that correctly. There's a few more policy highlights on oral signed administration with regarding to mostly signing it for students. And I don't think we have any students this year that will have to do that for. That's ASL. There we go. Spelling assistance.
Okay, so spelling assistance is pretty straightforward. It provides various types of support or assistance for a student with a disability. And who gets to make that call? One of two groups, the ARD committee or the 504 committee. So this can't be decided by MTSS. So there are very specific options, and they're on the left, that left slide, that first slide on the left. It says only the following options are allowed: online embedded spelling assistance, and you can see there what that includes, or non-embedded. Frequently non-embedded in the online system. A student can use a frequent word list, some kind of spell checking device, spell checking function on a word processor via setting it on the right permission mode, and word prediction software. Again, the key is this student using this accommodation routinely, independently, and effectively? So you can't just give them a frequently misspelled word list on the day of the STAAR test. That needs to be something they're used to utilizing. A student should be able to be capable of organizing and developing ideas and understand the basic function and the basic use of written language. For example, the examples they include are sentence structure, irregular verbs. However, if that student that can do all of those things has a disability that is so severe that he or she cannot apply basic spelling rules or word patterns, then they may be eligible for the spelling assistance accommodation. That is probably an individual, they're all individual decisions, right? That's probably a discussion. If you're not sure, talk to your diagnostician or speech pathologist or campus testing coordinator, and let's have that conversation.
Right, because it's talking about basic spelling words or word patterns like, and we don't talk about those whenever we get up into high school very much. We don't talk about CVC words. We talk about that in first grade and second grade. So you're looking at basic spelling rules, and it gives you silent letters, like you're talking about sneaky E, silent E, whatever you want to call it at the end. So those basic spelling patterns is what you're looking for that they still cannot do. So this one is probably pretty difficult to have spelling assistance on an assessment. This kind of gives you a little bit of what spelling assistance would look like with the drop down. A spell check does not identify grammatical error usages. It just guesses. And then we have supplemental aids. So this is for students that need extra support than in the language most appropriate. And this has its own separate presentation that your campus testing coordinators attended a whole presentation on, that TA puts out a presentation every year. There were not any changes in that if you have attended that before, but there are very specific things that can be used for students that do qualify for this and that cannot be used. So this is just kind of a preview, but again, there's a whole separate presentation on supplemental aid. So if you have questions about something that's allowed or not allowed, we can pull that out and go through that. That's what I do every year. Mnemonic devices, math charts, grammar, mechanics rules, graphics. And so you can see across there, different things are available for different subjects, different tests. That's a preview of what that presentation looks like. It gives you green checks for what's allowed, and things that are not allowed. So now we're going to move to the purple sheet, and I'm going pretty fast because we're already at 4:50. And so trying to get out of here. The purple section of this are the designated supports that require TA approval. And I'll let Amy talk through those really quickly because this doesn't happen very often. You have to have lots of data to support. And then I have to submit that to TA because TA has to approve those.
So this is the semi-famous ARF form. When you hear ARF, most of you probably think dogs, but it's in TEA land and public school testing land, it stands for Accommodation Request Form. So in Robinson, Colette's the only one that completes that. So if you even suspect that you need this, definitely talk to your ART committee, either through a staffing and your campus testing coordinator. But let's talk about which accommodations require an ARF through Colette to TEA. So the first one is complex transcribing. Remember earlier we talked about basic transcribing. Well, complex transcribing is exactly what it says, but it tells you what it is. It is where the TES, the
yes.
test administrator records it.
This is going to be for somebody that can't use speech to text probably, but that maybe somebody could understand them, and they're going to have to tell every single thing to be able to type it out for them
to someone that can understand them. I know there's at least a handful of kids who have pretty severe speech impediments, and they're very difficult to understand. So I'm not saying all SI kids with SI are eligible for transcribing. Don't get that twisted. But it's very, very specific. And like Colette said, it would be very, very rare.
Well, because they wouldn't be able to type it and they wouldn't be able to use speech to text. They'd have to have both of those things.
Right. And when they do complex, the student has to say, right, period, comma, capital I, all the details. So it's not just like we voice text. The student would have to say capital I space, think, space, that space, you space, R space, smart, period.
But they have to spell all that out.
Every letter? Well, there you go. See, I'm learning.
Yeah.
That's what I am. I'm a learner. Mathematics scribe, again, very unique, very specific. This is where they record the student's dictated scratch work and computations exactly as the student says it. So it's just like writing or reading, but it's math. So they would have to say 54 minus 61. Oh, this is math, so I'm probably going to get this wrong. 1 from 4 is 3. 6, can't take 6 from 5. I mean, you'd have to do the borrowing and the regrouping, all the math terms that I don't know.
You should have used some blank scratch paper for that. I'm going to fill in here extra day. Extra day is for a student that needs more than 1 day for testing. I don't know what that is. Accommodation request form ARF. Yes, I don't know, but yes, thank you. That is 100 on that response. So extra day is a very limited small group of kids with disabilities. So we have had this approved for one student before, so it's not very common. It's for a student that needs an extra day beyond the 7 hours for a disabling condition. The only one that I've seen approved in 2 different districts is for a student that had an eye condition that made them so tired that on their reading test only that they needed more than 1 day because they were so tired after reading all of that information over that time period. So I'm sure there are other conditions that could allow a student to have an extra day, but it's very limited. And then there's other. So if we think there's another special condition, but again, these would be pretty rare. So that goes through the accommodation request process. We already kind of talked about that. I do highly encourage you to make sure that you are using online practice and release tests with students. Most of us take interim assessments and then we go through the platform or we're taking TFAR tests and we get them in there, but you can also go through and we want to know and teach and help our students do those interim tests, those online platforms and stuff throughout the year, all of those things that are available to them and accessibility features and in accommodations. And when we can remind them to use them throughout the year, because we can't on the test day, teach them how to use those tools so that they can do the best that they can. And I know, most of you all know that that's definitely the stance that we want to take is teach them how to use those accommodations.
Because if it's the test day and this is the first time they've seen the system, they're going to have some anxiety, rejection, frustration, worry. We don't want that to be the first day they've seen the online program and all the options that they may be able to use. That's not the day they need to learn it.
So there's the accommodation resources again listed again. We have them linked on our site. And then the last few slides that we will also share and put on our assessment page is just talking about classroom accommodations. And we kind of talked about that at the beginning. There's no list for classroom accommodations. STAAR testing accommodations that we all just went through does not prevent you from doing something in a classroom accommodation just because it's not available on STAAR. But you do want to make sure that the things that you are doing in the classroom do align with what is allowed on STAAR to a certain extent as well.
Or that the accommodation is something they can learn to use independently by the time they get to STAAR. I'll give you an example. If you gave me some kind of list, like let's just say a list of multiplication examples, right? Like all the 9s, 9 times 1, just a chart of that. And I got used to using that. Well, I can't have that on STAAR. So now you've basically disabled me, for lack of a better term, because now I'm used to using that and I can't have it on STAAR. So like Colette said, you don't have to align them perfectly, but be aware of what's allowable and not. and then kind of work backwards into what you're doing in your in-class instruction.
Right. And so I know a lot of you that get the opportunity to sit in arts don't necessarily teach these core content areas. So you're not necessarily doing those, but yet you're a required member of the art committee, especially as we go up in grades and
You're required to do them.
You're required to sit in those art committees. So just being aware of the accommodations that are allowed and not allowed, and how to determine and where to go to make sure that the art, as a member of the art committee, that you're able to contribute to that decision and know what's allowed or not allowed for students. Instructional accommodation categories are listed there. We want to make sure that any accommodations are specific, clear, and complete whenever we put them in plans. The reason for that is because when they go into the next grade level, or the next person needs to know exactly what that means. And so this gives some examples of basic transcribing, a non-example, and then what an example would be that is clear, specific, and complete. So there are some examples in here.
And
as
some
well.
non-examples. Those are good to look at too.
Yeah. And then documenting accommodations. So making sure that you're documenting accommodations in the plan that works best for you, or what your campus has told you to do. There are some ways there that you can do that. And then, unless you have questions, that is our quick run through. I know it seems like we did not talk fast because it was 50 minutes long, but we tried to talk as fast as we could through all of those. So does anybody have any questions, Willie, that we cannot see?
Remember, there are no stupid questions.
So far, no question. I mean, the only one we had was from Deborah Matus, but other than that, no, I think haven't seen any. We got some thank yous coming across now. Yeah, no. So are there any closing thoughts?
Right. The only thing that I would say is you can always email me. I will answer your question as many times as you need, or give me a call. Let us know if you come across anything, or if you have any questions, especially if they're specific. I will honestly every time pull up those same documents that you have and just read through them every time, because I don't want to go off of my memory or my brain to make sure. And so, but if I also have other people to call that I'm happy to call and ask at TEA or at the service center or other places, or coordinators, to see if there's something that we did not cover or that we need to clarify. But we are here to support you, and we want you to have what you need to be able to be successful, for our students to be successful. So just reach out to us and let us know. All of these resources will be put on the staff resources site under the assessment page. And so in the link on the side, there's one that says assessment, and they will be there. And if you attended today, you do not get to take the quiz, but
You're
for
welcome.
those of you that are watching this recording, there is a Google form quiz that you get to take. It's 12 questions long, and good luck.
And remember, if you're in doubt, ask before you guess. Always ask. Like Colette said, we don't mind if you ask the same question over and over again. I take it as an opportunity for me to relearn and be sure I'm telling everybody the same answer, to be perfectly honest. But always ask before you guess. Actually, let me clarify that. Ask, don't guess. Always ask. I think that's it.
I think that's it. I hope that you all have a great Thanksgiving if we don't see you before then, and enjoy all your favorite, hope you have all your favorite foods.